It's green bean season, which means it's green bean canning season. And in this video, we're going to do exactly that. But we're not going to be doing ordinary pressure canned green beans, which incidentally, I've already made a video about. We're going to be making pickled green beans, sometimes also called dilly beans, though I've never really loved that name and I'm not sure why. Anyway, we're going to go through the whole process to take a whole bunch of fresh green beans, make up a vinegar brine, can them all up, and we're going to have some tasty, crispy, crunchy, amazing pickled green beans to enjoy whenever I want. And the first thing I need to do is start getting my green beans ready. So I'll give them all a thorough wash with some cold water, let them drip dry for a few minutes, and now I have to just go through the tedious step of chopping off all the little ends. Pretty straightforward, just taking the first little bit off of each bean to get rid of any little bits of stem, and if I see any weird green beans, any that are soggy or looking like they're starting to rot or otherwise fall apart, I'll just go ahead and get those out of there. A little pointed end on the other side. And today I've got pretty much a 50-50 mix of green beans that came from the garden and green beans that came from the store. And it's probably pretty obvious which ones came from which. And obviously if there's any beans that are too long to fit in the jars, we're gonna have to trim those down. And I guess that's more of a concern if you're doing this in pint jars, which are of course a lot shorter than quart jars. Anyway, I'll just keep going, keep chopping off the little ends until I've got them all nice and trimmed up. And here's what we're looking at after I trimmed up all the green beans. I started off with just about 4 pounds of green beans, and after trimming off all the ends and getting rid of a handful of weird looking ones, now I've got just about 3.5 pounds of beans to work with. And this will get me somewhere between 3 and 4 quart jars, which is what I'm going to be using today. And by the way, in the meantime, I've got my quart jars in the canner filled with water, coming up to a boil for the purposes of sanitizing the jars. Now, because this is going to be a hot water bath canning and the processing time is relatively short, about 10 minutes in my case, I do need to sanitize these jars. If I was doing a longer processing, either hot water bath or pressure canning, I don't necessarily need to do the jar sterilization step. I need to do it this time, so I've got them in the canner coming up to a boil, and I'll just let them boil for a few minutes. And in the meantime, it's time to start getting our brine together. So into my little stock pot goes 6 cups of white vinegar, and make sure to use the kind that says 5% acidity. Then 6 cups of water, 3/4 of a cup of kosher salt, and if you've got something that says canning salt or pickling salt, that works all the same. And then about a teaspoon of crushed red pepper flakes, just for a little extra flavor. And I'll get this heating up over high heat, stirring it all together, and I just want to bring it all up to a boil. In the meantime, I'm going to get my jars out of the canner, very carefully pour that hot water out of them, and move them over to the counter so we can start loading them up. First, I'm going to get a couple of heads of fresh dill put into each jar, followed by a couple cloves of garlic, and maybe just a pinch of whole peppercorns for good measure. Now I just need to start packing in all of those green beans. And because my beans are so varied in length, I know that I'm never gonna get them all perfectly lined up, standing up vertically, but I'll kind of start off with the intention of maybe trying to do that. Kind of tilt the jar somewhat on its side, just start loading them in there, packing them in any which way I can get, and pretty much filling that jar as tightly as I can, almost all the way to the top, but of course leaving 1/2 inch of headspace. Once my jars are about as packed as they can get, I'm going to do what is considered an optional step, and that's add a little bit of calcium chloride to each jar. Calcium chloride is just the generic name for a product called Pickle Crisp, which is very popular to use when pickling cucumbers and other things. It just helps keep the vegetable a little bit more crispy while it's processing in that hot water in a few minutes. So for quart-sized jars, I'm just going to sprinkle in 1/4 teaspoon worth of calcium chloride into each jar. If I was doing pints, I would go 1/8 of a teaspoon. And now that my brine has come up to a boil, it's time to just start ladling it into each jar. Again, I'll fill the jars all the way to the top, minus that 1/2 inch of headspace that we need. And once I've filled those jars up with the brine, I'm gonna go ahead and check that headspace with my little headspace measuring tool, identifying the notch on the tool that marks 1/2 of an inch. And it looks like I need a little bit more brine in all 4 of these jars. That's looking better, so now I'm gonna go ahead and de-bubble. And all that means is I'm gonna take the other end of this de-bubbling tool and just kind of work it around the jar the best I can, trying to kind of scrape the inside walls. And it's trickier to do when you've got a jar full of something like green beans, where it can be tricky to jam this little tool down in there. Some people use a chopstick instead, and that can work fine, but really we're just trying to dislodge any stray air bubbles that might be trapped down in there. We can also give each jar a gentle thunk on the counter to try to dislodge any of those bubbles. Next, we have to wipe the rims. So using a damp paper towel, I'll thoroughly clean the top edge of each jar to ensure that there's no brine mixture sitting on that top edge, which could obstruct our lids from forming a good seal. And speaking of our lids, let's talk about those for just a moment. Now, the sort of older methodology for doing the canning with jars and lids like this was that you're supposed to boil the lids. But in more modern times, the manufacturer actually doesn't recommend boiling the lids anymore, as it could possibly damage that rubber gasket. They say you can still simmer them or heat them up in some water, just not go a full boil. So that's what I do. Whether or not it's 100% necessary, I guess it's just sort of force of habit. So using the magnetic lid lifter tool, I'll go ahead and grab each lid out of there and set it in place on the jar. From there, all I have to do is put the metal rings in place and tighten them down. And I don't need to crank them down overly tight. Just get them pretty snug with my fingers. Now these jars are ready to start processing, so we're moving back over to the stove. Now our jars are just about ready to put back into the canner to start processing. But a step that I like to take first serves as sort of a fail-safe to make sure that there's almost zero chance of breaking any jars. And that's to check the temperature of the water that's in the canner, which is still quite hot from the jar sterilization step we did earlier, and also check the temperature of the jars themselves. We want the temperature of the canner water and the jar temperature to be pretty close to the same. It's those big temperature fluctuations that can cause breakage, such as putting a too cold jar into a too hot canner full of water, or vice versa. So I used my little infrared digital thermometer thingy to first check the temperature of the water, and I can see that it's cooled down to about 132 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I'll check one of my jars and do the exact same thing, and I can see that the temperature is about 124 degrees. And that's pretty close, but I wouldn't mind it being a little closer. So, considering that I think I need to add a little more water to the canner anyway, I'll just pour a little bit of cold water in there. Now we're down to about 122, and I'm liking that. The temperature of the water in the jar are very close, and now I feel perfectly safe putting those jars in. So once again, using the jar lifter tool, I'll just go ahead and set these jars in, and I'll take care to make sure that none of the jars are touching one another or the outside walls of the canner. And with the help of my wooden spoon handle, I can see that the level of my water is a good inch above the top level of the jar lids, and that's what I'm looking for. So now I'm just gonna turn the heat on high and let this thing come up to a full rolling boil. Once it's hit that full rolling boil, our processing time has begun. And for these quart jars, I need to process for 10 minutes. For pint jars, I could go 5 minutes. And of course, both of those times need to be adjusted if you live at a high altitude, that is over 1,000 feet. Alright, we've reached a full rolling boil, so that means the processing time has begun. So I'll put the lid back on, set my timer for 10 minutes, and we'll pick it up then. Okay, the processing time is done, and now I'm just going to remove the jars from the canner using my jar lifter tool and set them on a towel on the counter. Now there's nothing left to do except nothing. I have to wait until these jars are cooled completely to room temperature before I do anything else with them. And over the next little while, I'll expect to hear each lid on each jar pop signifying a successful seal. That pop is the center of the lid pulling inward, and once the jars are cool, you can tell that it's popped because if you press on the center of the lid, you will not be able to feel it move in and out. And as always, if any of the jars don't seal, well, I cannot consider that jar to be shelf stable. And I could try putting on a new lid and reprocessing it, but usually I'll just take that jar, throw it in the fridge, and make sure to use it first. And a failed seal doesn't happen often, but it does happen, and it happens to everyone. And as for the sealed jars, well, they're ready to put up on the shelf and enjoy anytime I want. And I will mention that it's advised to store them with the rings off. This is because you can get some surface rust underneath that ring, and eventually it could lead to damaging the seal of the lid. So I guess that's about it. But one more note. I do highly recommend waiting at least a few days before digging into your jar of pickled green beans. In fact, I like to wait a solid week before I even think about popping open a lid. And that's because during that time, the flavors of the brine and the green beans are going to develop a lot more. It's going to get less vinegary and more tasty dill pickly in flavor. And I personally like to enjoy them cold, so I'll chill a jar in the fridge for at least a full day before I intend to dig into them. And I've actually put off shooting this intro and outro for a week after actually canning these things. So I can pop one of these jars open right now and give it a taste. And doing this not on the countertop is dramatically increasing my risk of somehow spilling this vinegary brine all over myself. Okay, I think that was a success. I know you heard how crunchy that thing is. The perfect dill pickled green bean. If you've got a whole bunch of fresh green beans laying around and you want to figure out how to preserve them for the rest of the year, give this method a try. Freezing's great, regular pressure canning's great, but this is just a little extra crispy, salty, briny treat that I think you're gonna like. And I'll put the exact recipe for the brine that I made, as well as the details about the canning and processing time and so forth, in the video description below. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future pickling and canning videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/GreatLakesCountry. Thanks for watching, and a big thank you to all the Patreon subscribers for your continued support of this channel. And until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.